Charles Spencer just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally breaking the sacred silence he had carried inside his chest for 28 agonizing, suffocating years, standing beneath the vaulted mahogany ceilings of Althorp House, with a cream-colored envelope trembling in his aristocratic fingers. The 9th Earl at last shattering the solemn brotherly vow he had made to his sister on a rain-lashed September afternoon in 1997 when the world was still choking on its own tears. He had sworn upon their mother's grave, upon the swallow crest of the Spencer coat of arms, upon every fiber of the blood that bound him to the woman the world called the People's Princess, that certain letters would never see daylight, that certain names would never be spoken aloud, that certain betrayals would remain sealed behind the crimson wax of private grief. But something catastrophic had happened 3 nights ago inside the palace machinery, something so devastating, so ruthlessly calculated, that even the 9th Earl of Spencer, a man who had built his entire post-1997 existence around dignified restraint, could no longer keep the failsafe locked. What exactly did Diana predict in the final weeks before that Paris tunnel swallowed her whole? Why did she explicitly forbid her brother from ever showing this particular letter to anyone bearing the surname Windsor? And what dark, hidden tragedy inside Kensington Palace last week finally compelled Charles Spencer to break the most sacred promise he had ever made to the sister he had failed to save? The library at Althorp House was cavernous and hauntingly quiet that pale, frost-tinged November morning, the kind of English silence that settles only inside houses that have been holding secrets for 400 years. Weak lemon light filtered in through the mullioned windows, catching the dust motes as they danced above the leather-bound Spencer family Bibles, above the Van Dyck portraits of long-dead earls whose painted eyes seemed to watch their descendant with a grave ancestral disapproval. The great-grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had chimed the hour Diana was born in July 1961, ticked with a slow, deliberate, almost funereal rhythm. On the mahogany desk before him, illuminated by a single brass reading lamp, lay a cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by 28 years of careful preservation, its crimson wax seal cracked but intact, still bearing the unmistakable imprint of the Spencer swallow, that childhood symbol Diana had used only for letters she considered too dangerous to trust to any Windsor hand. Beside it sat a smaller object, a tarnished silver cipher key on a length of black ribbon, and beside that, an unopened forensic envelope stamped with the discreet insignia of a private London laboratory. Charles Spencer reached out with fingers that would not stop trembling, and touched the wax seal as though it might crumble to ash beneath his skin. His voice, when he finally spoke, was grayly and weighted, cracked at its edges like old parchment. "For 28 years, he said, addressing the single camera that had been permitted into the room, addressing the 20 million viewers already tuned into the live encrypted feed, addressing the ghost of the sister who had begged him to protect her boys. The world has spoken for Diana. The palace has spoken for Diana. The men in gray have spoken for Diana. Today, at long last, I am speaking for Diana." Behind the camera, a young producer named Elena Voss, the granddaughter of one of Diana's original Kensington staff, hand-picked by Spencer for her loyalty, stood with her clipboard pressed against her chest, her knuckles white, a thin bead of sweat tracing the line of her jaw. In her earpiece, she could already hear the frantic chatter of the palace communications office attempting to jam the satellite uplink, attempting to trigger the emergency broadcasting protocols that had been dormant since the 1980s, attempting to persuade Ofcom that a matter of national sensitivity required immediate intervention. But the feed held. The servers, mirrored across 3 private data centers in Zurich, Reykjavik, and a nameless facility beneath the Highlands of Scotland, held. Charles Spencer had built his failsafe carefully, patiently, over the course of 11 years. Nothing on earth was going to cut this signal now. He lifted the cream-colored envelope into the pool of lamplight, and the swallow crest caught the glow like a wound. "This letter," he said quietly, "was written by my sister on the 18th of August, 1997, 13 days before she died. It was addressed to Her Royal Highness the Princess Anne. It was never delivered, and it has never, until this moment, been seen by another human being outside the walls of Althorp." 20 million screens flickered simultaneously. In pubs from Edinburgh to Cornwall, pint glasses froze mid-air. In Kensington, in Buckingham, in Clarence House, in Highgrove, in every gilded chamber where the ruthless machinery of the palace hummed its ancient rhythm, telephones began to ring, not the modern digital chirps of the 21st century, but the older, sharper, more dreadful sound of encrypted internal lines that were only ever used when the institution itself was under existential threat. He remembered then the summer of 1969. He had been 5 years old, Diana 8, and they had been racing barefoot across the water meadows at Park House on the Sandringham estate, the scent of white gardenias thick in the August air, the drone of bees hanging in the heat like a lullaby. Diana had stopped suddenly, her small hand catching his wrist with unexpected force, and pointed up at a low swallow cutting arcs across the pale blue sky. "That's what I'm going to be, Charles," she had said, her child's voice grave beyond its years. "A swallow, because swallows always come home, even when nobody wants them to." He had laughed then, in the careless way that little brothers laugh at their older sisters. He was not laughing now, because the swallow embossed into the crimson wax of the letter in his hand was the same swallow Diana had drawn in every childhood diary, in every private letter, in every secret communication with the 4 women she had trusted in the final years of her life. And Princess Anne, he now knew, had been one of those 4. The revelation, when he began to unfold it, came in layers, the way all true revelations do. He spoke first of the summer of 1996, of the corridors of Kensington Palace after the divorce had been finalized, of the way Diana had begun to notice a particular figure moving through those corridors with the silent, deliberate authority of a man who answered to no elected government and no reigning monarch. A tall man, always in charcoal gray, his Oxford shoes polished to a mirror sheen, his cold pale eyes never quite meeting anyone's gaze, a leather clipboard tucked eternally beneath his left arm. He was not a royal by blood, he was not a household name. He would never appear in any tabloid, any biography, any authorized history of the Windsor family. But he was, Charles Spencer said, his voice hardening into iron, the true architect of every catastrophe that had befallen his sister from the moment she had dared to speak her own truth. Diana had called him only the gardener, because, she had told her brother in a bitter, whispered conversation at Christmas 1995, he prunes the family. He prunes anyone who grows the wrong way. The gardener, Spencer said, had been operating inside the palace apparatus since 1978. He had been one of the men who had first vetted a young Diana Spencer as a suitable bride. He had been one of the men who had authored the memoranda about her emotional fragility. He had been one of the men who, in the summer of 1996, had signed off on a document Diana had photographed with a small silver camera hidden in her handbag, recommending that the subject's public platform be curtailed by any administrative means necessary. And it was the gardener, Spencer said, whose real name, his full name, his date of birth, his service record, had been written by Diana into the letter now trembling in his hand, along with a date, a very specific date, a date that was, by cruel coincidence or by terrifying prophecy, precisely yesterday. Elena Voss's hand shook so violently that her clipboard slipped and struck the marble floor with a crack that echoed through the library like a gunshot. Charles Spencer did not flinch. He had been waiting 28 years for that crack. "She didn't just predict this moment," he said, and his voice dropped into a register so quiet that the microphones had to strain to catch it. "She named the exact person. She named the exact date. She named the exact mechanism. My sister, the woman the world dismissed as unstable, as emotional, as paranoid, sat down at her writing desk on the 18th of August, 1997, and mapped out with mathematical, forensic, chilling precision the exact administrative coup that would be attempted against her sons 28 years later. And she sent the map, or tried to send the map, to the one woman inside the Windsor family who she believed had both the spine and the sovereignty to stop it, her sister-in-law, the Princess Royal, Anne. He remembered then the winter of 1992, the Annus Horribilis, the year the palace had begun, in Diana's own trembling words, to close its jaws. He had walked with her along the frost-covered gravel paths of Sandringham on Boxing Day, the biting cold turning their breath to ghosts, and she had told him, in a voice stripped of all its usual brightness, that Anne had come to her the night before. Anne, whose reputation was that of aristocratic composure and horsewoman's steel. Anne, who had never in her life offered Diana anything warmer than a brisk nod across a dinner table. Anne had come to Diana's private sitting room after the Queen's speech, had closed the door behind her, and had said only 7 words. "If they move against your boys, telephone me." Then she had turned and walked out, her riding boots striking the parquet floor with the rhythmic click of an Oxford metronome, and she had never referred to the conversation again. Diana had told Charles that night that she had wept for an hour afterwards, not from fear, from the shock of unexpected kindness inside a fortress that had spent a decade teaching her that kindness was a weakness the institution could not afford. For 28 years the world had been fed a very different narrative. Diana and Anne, the tabloids had insisted, were rivals. Diana and Anne, the authorized biographers had written, were temperamental opposites who barely spoke. Diana and Anne, the men in gray had whispered into the ears of every journalist who mattered, had loathed one another from the moment they first met at Windsor in 1980. There were the famous stories, the christening of Prince Harry that Anne had declined to attend, the frosty silences at royal luncheons, the seating arrangements at state banquets that had been carefully choreographed to keep them at opposite ends of the room. And behind every one of those stories, Charles Spencer now said, his voice thickening with a fury he had been swallowing for a quarter of a century, was the gardener. The gardener, who had understood before anyone else in that suffocating palace machinery that if Diana Spencer and Anne Windsor ever formed an alliance, if the People's Princess ever joined forces with the Princess Royal, the only Windsor woman with both military bearing and constitutional standing, then the men in grey would lose their grip on the succession forever. So he had pruned, quietly, ruthlessly, year after year. A misplaced invitation here, a leaked briefing there, a carefully seeded rumor to a friendly columnist at the Express, a whispered word in the ear of a private secretary. And slowly, over a decade, the palace had constructed the fiction of a feud that had never existed, sealing Diana into an isolation so complete that by the summer of 1997 she had been forced to write her most urgent, most desperate, most prophetic letter of all. And even that letter had been intercepted before it could reach the woman it was meant for. Charles Spencer touched the tarnished silver cipher key with the reverence of a priest touching a relic. This, he said, was couriered to me in October of 1997, 6 weeks after my sister's funeral, by a former member of the Kensington household staff who has since passed away. It was posted from a village in County Cork with no return address. It contained no letter, only this key, and a single line of type on a scrap of hotel notepaper. The false bottom of the mahogany writing desk, the one that was hers. It has taken me 28 years, and the quiet forensic assistance of 3 former officers of British military intelligence, to understand what this key was designed to open. It was designed to open a compartment in a piece of furniture that was moved out of Kensington Palace in September of 1997, and shipped, by administrative sleight of hand, to a storage facility in Berkshire. A piece of furniture that was returned to this house, to Althorpe, to me, only 11 months ago, following a discreet legal settlement whose terms I am not permitted to disclose. He rose from the desk. The camera followed him as he crossed the library to a Georgian writing desk positioned beneath a Van Dyck portrait of the 5th Earl. He knelt beside it, slid the silver cipher key into a keyhole so small it was nearly invisible in the marquetry, and turned it. The mechanical click of the hidden compartment opening was small, precise, and utterly devastating. Somewhere in the palace, 20 million viewers heard it, and somewhere in the palace, a telephone began to ring that had not rung since 1953. From the false bottom of the desk, Charles Spencer withdrew a second envelope. This one was thicker, heavier. Its wax seal was black rather than crimson, the color Diana had used, her brother said, for documents she considered beyond private, beyond secret, beyond even the swallow. Beside it lay a slim manila folder, its cover stamped in faded red ink, with the words Household Administrative Memoranda. And beneath that, in Diana's own unmistakable looping hand, the words He thinks I do not know. Elena Voss made a small sound behind the camera. It was not quite a sob. It was closer to the noise a person makes when they realize too late that they have been standing at the edge of a cliff. Then the phone rang. Not the encrypted feed, not the palace lines. The antique black rotary telephone at the far end of the library. The one that had belonged to Charles Spencer's grandmother. The one whose number had been given, in the entirety of the 9th Earl's adult life, to only 4 people. It rang with the sharp, brassy insistence of an instrument built in 1938, and every ring seemed to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Charles Spencer looked at the camera. The camera looked at him. Then he crossed the room and lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was small, broken, stripped entirely of the sovereign composure that its owner had spent 40 years constructing. It was the voice of a 15-year-old boy walking behind a gun carriage in September of 1997, a boy who had promised himself he would never cry in public again, and who had now, at 43, discovered that some promises are impossible to keep. "Uncle Charles," the voice said. And then it broke. Charles Spencer closed his eyes. He did not need to be told which of his nephews was on the line. He had known, from the moment he had decided to break the seal, which of the 2 boys would call first. William had always been the elder son in every way that mattered, the one who carried the weight, the one who absorbed the blows, the one who had inherited not only his mother's cheekbones but her terrible suffocating sense of duty to protect his brother from truths that would break him. "I need you to listen to me, William," Charles Spencer said, and his own voice was suddenly gentler than it had been all morning, the voice of an uncle rather than an earl. "I need you to breathe, I need you to sit down, and I need you to know that everything I am about to say on this broadcast, your mother knew. Your mother wrote down. Your mother tried to send to your Aunt Anne 13 days before she died. And your mother has been waiting 28 years for someone to have the courage to say it aloud." There was a long silence on the line. Then William said, in a voice so quiet it barely qualified as speech, "Is it him?" Charles Spencer opened his eyes. "Yes," he said. "It is him. It has always been him, albeit Althorpe within the hour. The line went dead. 20 million people had heard only Charles Spencer's side of the conversation. 20 million people did not need to hear the other side. The nation held its breath. In Edinburgh, in Cardiff, in Belfast, in the villages of the West Country and the estates of the home counties, pint glasses that had frozen mid-air an hour ago were now being set down entirely, untouched. In Kensington, the Palace Communications Office had gone eerily silent. Whoever had been jamming the uplink had stopped trying. Somewhere in the machinery, a decision had been made that the damage was already done, and that further interference would only compound it. Charles Spencer returned to the mahogany desk. He set the black sealed envelope beside the cream-colored one. He set the manila folder beside them both, and then he did something that no one had expected. He reached into the breast pocket of his dark suit and withdrew a small, worn photograph. A photograph of two children on a summer lawn in 1969. A barefoot girl of 8 and her barefoot brother of 5, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them laughing at something long since forgotten. He propped the photograph against the base of the reading lamp so that it faced the camera, and he said, very quietly, "I am doing this for her, and I am doing this for her boys. Nothing else has ever mattered." He broke the black wax seal. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written in Diana's slanting, hurried hand on the cream-colored stationery of Kensington Palace, dated the 18th of August, 1997. He did not read it in full. Some passages, he said, were too personal, too raw, too much a mother's private cry to be read aloud on any broadcast, no matter how many millions were watching. But he read enough. He read the passages that mattered. He read them in a voice that grew steadier with every sentence, as though the act of speaking his sister's words was returning to him some fragment of a strength he had lost in a Paris tunnel a lifetime ago. "My dear Anne," Diana had written, "I am writing to you because you are the only person inside this family who has ever spoken to me as though I were a soldier rather than a symbol. I remember what you said to me at Sandringham in 1992. I have not forgotten. I have never forgotten. And I am afraid the moment you warned me of has now arrived. There is a man inside this household, you know the man I mean. You have known him longer than I have, who has, over the course of the past 18 months, begun to construct an administrative apparatus around my sons that I believe is designed to isolate them, to shape them, and in the fullness of time, to sever them from any influence that is not sanctioned by the firm. He believes I do not see it. He believes I am too distracted, too heartbroken, too emotionally compromised to read the memoranda he circulates. He is wrong. I have read every one. I have kept copies of every one. They are in the false bottom of my writing desk, beneath the swallow crest, along with this letter, which I fear I may not have the courage to send. Anne, if anything happens to me, and I do not say this from the paranoia that they will accuse me of, but from the cold and calculated reading of a woman who has learned at last how her enemies operate, I need you to promise me one thing. Not for me, for William and Harry. Promise me that you will not allow the gardener, or any of the men who serve him, to be given administrative authority over my sons' households after I am gone. Promise me that you will use the standing you have as a princess royal, as a working member of this family, as a woman whose spine has never bent to the men in gray, to keep him away from my boys. He will try. He is patient. He will wait years, decades if necessary, but he will try. And when he tries, I need someone inside the walls to say no on my behalf. You do not owe me this, Anne. We have never been close, though I have always believed that was more the fault of the machinery than of either of us. But my sons will owe you everything, whether they ever know it or not. I am trusting you with the only thing I have left that matters. Please, please, please." Charles Spencer lowered the letter. The library was silent. 20 million viewers were silent. The nation was silent. He remembered then the spring of 1981, the weeks before the wedding at St. Paul's, the afternoon Diana had come to him at Eton and told him, with a small terrified laugh, that she had begun to understand that the family she was about to marry into was not really a family at all but a very old, very tired institution wearing a family's clothes. He had not understood her then. He had been 16. He had told her she was being dramatic. He had told her that everything would be fine. He had told her that she was about to become the most loved woman in the world. He had not known, how could he have known, at 16, that everything would not be fine, that the men in gray had already begun to compile their memoranda, that the gardener was already, in that spring of 1981, sitting in a small office off a corridor of Buckingham Palace with a leather clipboard on his lap, mapping the pruning of a girl who had not yet even walked down the aisle. He turned to the manila folder. The documents inside, he said, would in due course be released to the appropriate authorities, to legal counsel, to selected members of Parliament. to a small number of trusted journalists at publications whose editorial independence had not yet been compromised by proximity to the palace. He would not read them aloud tonight. It was enough, he said, that they existed. It was enough that they were now known to exist. It was enough that the man they named, the gardener, the pruner, the architect, the invisible hand, would spend the rest of his life knowing that a dead woman's brother had outmaneuvered him from beyond a grave in a village churchyard on an island in the middle of a lake at Althorpe. But he would say the man's role. He would not say the name. That, he said, was for the courts to say, and for the press to publish once the legal machinery was in motion. But he would say the role. He would say the position. Because the man, Charles Spencer said, his voice now colder than the frost on the mullioned windows, was still operating inside the palace today. Not retired, not reassigned, not sanctioned, still there. Still moving through the corridors in his charcoal gray suits and his polished Oxford shoes. Still carrying his leather clipboard. Still whispering into the ears of private secretaries and household controllers. Still pruning. He held one of the most senior administrative positions inside the royal household, a position invisible to the public, unmentioned in any official register, but wielding more day-to-day power over the movements, communications, and staffing of the working royals than any duke or duchess in the realm. He has served 4 monarchs, Charles Spencer said. He has outlasted 6 prime ministers. He has buried 3 of the men he trained. He was in the room when the decision was made in the summer of 1996 to curtail my sister's public platform. He was in the room when the arrangements were made for her funeral. He was in the room when the households of William and Harry were first constituted in 1997. He has been in the room every time it has mattered, for 47 years. And my sister named him, dated him, and mapped him, 13 days before she died. The second phone call came then. This one was not the antique rotary. This one was the encrypted line. The one Elena Voss had been monitoring in her earpiece. The one connected directly to the private communications suite at Frogmore. Elena stepped forward, her clipboard forgotten on the floor, and murmured something to Charles Spencer that the microphones did not catch. He nodded once. He crossed to a small side table where a modern satellite handset sat blinking. He lifted it. "Harry," he said quietly. The voice on the other end was thousands of miles away, transmitted through a chain of encrypted relays that spanned 3 continents. But even through the compression, even through the digital scrambling, it was unmistakable. It was the voice of the younger son, the one who had never quite recovered from walking behind a gun carriage at 12, the one who had spent his adult life fighting a war against the same machinery that had ground his mother down, and who had, until this moment, believed himself to be fighting it largely alone. "Uncle Charles," Harry said, and his voice was fractured, was hollowed out, was the voice of a man who had just discovered that every conspiracy he had ever whispered about had been, if anything, an underestimation. "I'm boarding a plane." "I know," Charles Spencer said. "Is William?" "He's already on his way." There was a silence. Then Harry said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "She knew. She actually knew. All of it. She knew. She knew, my boy. She knew, and she tried to tell someone, and they wouldn't let her. Anne never received the letter. Anne is going to learn what she was meant to know from this broadcast, alongside the rest of the country. That, too, is something the man in the charcoal suit will have to answer for." The line went quiet. Then Harry said, "Thank you, Uncle Charles." "Don't thank me yet, Harry. Thank your mother. She wrote the map. I only opened the envelope." He set the handset down. Across the country, the consequences began to unfold with the terrible momentum of a machine that had, for the first time in half a century, slipped its gears. At Kensington Palace, William's private secretary was seen ordering the immediate lockdown of every administrative file relating to his household staffing decisions since 2011. At Buckingham Palace, the press office issued a single-sentence statement. "The palace has no comment at this time," which was, in itself, a comment more devastating than any denial could have been. At Gatcombe Park, the country home of the Princess Royal, the lights in the study burned late into the night, and a courier was dispatched shortly before midnight carrying a sealed document to the London chambers of a barrister who specialized, discreetly, in matters of constitutional law. At Clarence House, an elderly gentleman in a charcoal gray suit was said, by 2 members of the household staff who later spoke on strict condition of anonymity, to have walked into the small private chapel at 11:30 that evening, and to have knelt there in silence for nearly an hour. "He did not pray," one of the witnesses said. "He simply knelt. He simply knew." Back in the library at Althorpe, Charles Spencer sat down. For the first time since the broadcast had begun, he looked tired. Not defeated. The 9th Earl of Spencer had spent 28 years training himself to never look defeated, but tired in the marrow, tired in the soul, tired in the way that a man is tired when he has finally set down a weight he did not realize he had been carrying for half his life. He picked up the small photograph from beside the reading lamp. He looked at the barefoot girl of 8, and the barefoot boy of 5, and the summer lawn of 1969 that no longer existed except in the fading emulsion of an old picture and the failing memories of a middle-aged man. A single tear traced the line of his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He did not perform grief for the camera. He simply let it fall, because it was, at last, a tear he had earned the right to shed. "I made her a promise," he said, and his voice was so quiet the microphones almost lost it. "In September of 1997, at her graveside on the island, I told her I would look after her boys. For a very long time I did not know how. For a very long time I believed the only way to keep the promise was to stay silent, because that was what the family lawyers told me, and that was what the palace lawyers told me, and that was what the men in gray told me. I was wrong. Silence was never the way to keep the promise. Silence was how they wanted the promise to die. The promise is kept by speaking. The promise is kept tonight." He remembered then the last time he had ever seen her alive. It had been the 18th of July, 1997, 6 weeks before the tunnel. She had come to Althorpe for an afternoon, without staff, without press, without ceremony, just herself in a pale linen dress and a pair of sunglasses, driving up the long avenue in a hired car with the windows down and her hair whipping in the summer wind. They had walked together around the lake, past the small island where their mother was buried, and she had told him, in a tone that was almost cheerful, that she thought she had finally worked out how to protect the boys. She had told him she had written a letter. She had told him she was going to send it that week. She had told him that if anything ever happened to her, he was to look, always, in the false bottom of the writing desk beneath the Swallow. She had said all this while smiling at the ducks on the water, in a voice as light as if she were describing a shopping list. He had told her, laughing, that she was being melodramatic. She had squeezed his hand and said, "One of us has to be, Charles, and it isn't going to be you." She had been right. It had never been him. It had always been her. He lifted the cream-colored envelope, the one with the crimson swallow seal, the one Diana had written but had never quite dared to send. He folded it, carefully, back into its original creases. He placed it inside a small mahogany box lined with black velvet, a box that had belonged, he said, to his grandmother, and before that to his great-grandmother, and before that to a Spencer countess who had died in 1863. He closed the lid. He set the tarnished silver cipher key on top of the box, and he said very simply, "In the morning, this box will be carried out to the island in the lake, and it will be buried beside my sister, where it should have rested from the beginning, where no man in a charcoal gray suit will ever reach it again. The letter has done its work. Diana has done her work. The Swallow, at long last, has come home." Behind the camera, Elena Voss was openly weeping. She had not made a sound. She had not moved. But her cheeks were wet, and her hands were still, and her clipboard was still lying on the marble floor where it had fallen an hour ago. She would leave it there, later, when she walked out of the library. She would not pick it up. Some things, she would understand in the years to come, were meant to be left where they fell. Charles Spencer looked one last time into the lens. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He wore, instead, the expression of a man who has finished a long and terrible errand, and is now, at last, permitted to go home. "To my sister," he said quietly, "I say only this. I am sorry it took me 28 years. I am sorry I did not understand, until tonight, that the promise you asked me to keep was not a promise of silence but a promise of witness. I am sorry that Anne never received your letter. But she has received it now. The country has received it now. Your boys have received it now. And the man in the charcoal suit, the gardener, the pruner, the invisible architect of so much of our sorrow, has received it too. His garden is finished, Diana. His shears have been taken from him. Rest now. Rest at last. Your Swallow has come home." He reached forward. He switched off the reading lamp on the mahogany desk. The library sank into pale gray November light. The camera held on the small photograph of 2 children on a summer lawn in 1969, and on the closed mahogany box beside it, and on the shape of a 9th Earl sitting very still in his ancestor's chair. And then, gently, without music, without commentary, without any of the machinery of modern broadcasting that would ordinarily rush to fill such a silence, the feed cut to black. Across the United Kingdom, 20 million screens went dark at the same moment. In pubs, in living rooms, in Whitehall offices, in the small back rooms of palace press departments, in a country house in Gloucestershire, where the Princess Royal was sitting alone with a letter that had finally, 28 years late, been read into her presence, no one moved, no one spoke, no one turned the lights back on. There was only the enormous, cathedral-like silence of a nation that had just been told, at long last, The truth about a woman it had been told lies about for a quarter of a century. The swallow had flown free. The promise had been kept. The secret was out.